Hey, I'm Chadillac, and this is the Cage Rage Podcast. I'm here with fight analyst, archivist, and guest host, Miguel Iturrate. We're here to talk about brain injury today in boxing. It's an ongoing struggle that boxing has been facing for generations. It's specifically come up again lately with last weekend's events. I'm going to let Miguel take away from here and talk about this. Miguel, what's going on with this?
Well, boxing has a scary situation once again with one of their fighters, and this time it's a former world champion. At this point, and you say former world champion because he lost his belt this past Saturday, and that's Adonis Stevenson. Obviously, the belt is really just secondary. He's a long-time champion. He was actually the oldest world champion going at 41 years old, and he was the longest reigning world champion because he held his belt for about 6 years. So you got to say a decorated champion, right? One loss back in the day. He himself possesses pretty heavy knockout power, and he'd been in his fights in Canada. This happened in Canada, and he'd been a main event star there for years and years. He was taking out Oleksandr Gvozdyk, undefeated. The guy, he fights out of the Ukraine, and he's one of those other guys that, because they come from a country where they have a huge amateur system, he's got a vast amateur background. He's far more advanced than, a 15-0 fighter coming up. He's now 16-0, and he's now a world champion with Adonis Stevenson's, and you hate to say it this way, but Adonis Stevenson's scalp on his resume. And we'll leave it at that. I don't want to be tasteless. Adonis Stevenson was taken to the hospital after the fight, and at that point with a boxer, when they start to see pressure on the brain or other things like that, they do induce a coma. When I hear that a coma gets induced, now I'm not familiar with the medical procedure. I know, Chad, you're going to help us out with some of that stuff.
Okay.
But when they induce a coma, to me, that's usually a very bad sign. At that point, you're throwing boxing out the window. You're just looking to work on the guy, make sure that he can, walk out of there and he's cognizant and stuff like that. Because, there have been examples recently in Adonis. Hopefully everything is good with him. But I don't like what we're hearing.
Okay, well, let me address what inducing a coma generally means. Okay, so first of all, to induce a coma in a traumatic brain injury, we'll call it TBI just for short. So in a TBI situation, the patient comes in or the subject comes in, and when they present, they're going to look at a few things. And they're going to say, in Adonis's case, he wasn't able to produce respiration. In other words, he wasn't breathing on his own. So he collapsed in the locker room, and that's when they took him to the hospital. He was unable to produce his own breathing, and when that happened, they said, okay, we've got to get him shut down. And the reason that they do that is because that slows the body's metabolism down. And what happens when they slow the body's metabolism down is it stops the brain from swelling. Because the brain, when it starts to swell, everything else shuts down, because the brain can't produce all the things it's supposed to do, and it's squeezing the brain stem. The brain stem is what actually makes all of your reptilian functions go. In other words, your autonomic nervous system work. So breathing, heartbeat, stuff like that. And so that's why they induce coma.
Yeah, and the examples, and here's the part where, in boxing isn't, front page ESPN news or front even, maybe this got a brief moment on it, or maybe even, enjoyed front page, but for a day or two, it's not like, they're going to be following the Adonis Stevenson story in recovery for a while.
Yeah.
This is going to fade away a little bit, and he's going to be left in a coma, and I think that's our recent example of it, on the Premier Boxing Champions show. There was a young fighter named Pritchard Colon who had a rugged fight by all accounts, and it was on TV, and he wound up in a coma for an extended period of time if he's not still in a coma.
Yeah.
And here's the part is, after a certain extent, the family's kind of left on their own. You know what I mean? So that's where boxing really becomes, real open to tragedies. Because a lot of these guys, it's like you're worried that are they paying Blue Cross Blue Shield, with their fighter earnings? Are they banging out? Or they think they're indestructible athletes and letting some of that stuff go by the wayside. Because there's just horrible examples out there. You remember Gerald McClellan?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I mean, Gerald McClellan has been taken care of by his sister for, however many years it's been. Might be 25, 30 years now since he lost it in his fight. And that's a situation where every once in a while the boxing community gets together and maybe does a little fundraiser and things like that, to help out. But he's getting help from his sister. His sister takes care of him, and she has a job with medical insurance, and they get by and stuff like that. But he's living like that now, and that fight happened in 1995, so it's 22 years now.
Yeah.
That he's been unable to take care of himself. So you do worry about guys. Hopefully, I don't know, Stevenson. Hopefully, he was able to put some money away. But I mean, you fought. Nobody knows better than you, Chad. I mean, can anything drain a bank account better than a medical expense? A medical trauma in the United States nowadays. I mean,
well, yeah. I mean, just I guess at this point I should kind of explain to people what my situation is. My son was in an accident in 2010 with my mother. Just an automobile accident, could happen to anyone. And he suffered a traumatic brain injury at 3.5 years old. It was very severe, global injury, followed by a massive stroke, bifrontal flap removal, the whole thing. So he lived for 6 months with the front of his skull completely out of his head, and because the swelling on his brain was so severe. We're doing the Soda Pop and Cadillac Cage Rage podcast show because he likes to do it, and it helps with his speech. But it's been 8 years, and we're working on teaching him how to speak after 8 years. So, and he's a little kid, and so that was the greatest thing he had going for him was his age. Now, and he had induced coma. We lived in hospitals for months and months and months and months. And I had, I made a really good living and had a huge savings account, and we have nothing now. So the idea that you can have enough money to get through with this, people think that, oh well, he's a champion and so he should be fine, and he's put away all this money. Well, first of all, you spend what you make, and we know that through guys even like the tales you tell of Sugar Ray Robinson and the greats that died penniless, that lived these extravagant lifestyles, and then when they died, they had nothing. Was Stevenson somebody who was really savvy and had an amazing portfolio? Perhaps you can talk on that a little bit. I don't know. I don't know if you know that either, and that'd be a pretty difficult thing to have privy to. But that being said, no one can stand up to the pressures of that kind of financial pressure, medical financial pressures in those institutions. No matter how much money you have, it drains you no matter what. It just does. And the way the American system is set up, since we don't have socialized medicine, the American system is set up that you have to drain every single thing you have before you can get any sort of socialized help. So you have to become poor in order to get help. So if he does have anything, it will be gone before he can ever get anything.
Let's be clear about a couple of things. First of all, and one of the problems with Adonis and people in this situation too is that in all likelihood the income stopped, or at least the bulk of the income. There may be some investments that return and stuff like that, but it'd be unusual for that to be like, well, he took his money and now he's investing and he makes so much money off investing. I don't think he'd be fighting at 41. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know the details, but it doesn't add up. And yeah, the income is stopped now. So that's a problem. Now, let's be clear about one thing, and this is me, saying America in the first place. He's from Canada. He's Canadian. He's going to be under Canadian medical system, which is a little bit different. But, and I'm not an expert. I don't know anything about it really, but I did live in Canada for a year and a half, 2 years. And my tendency to believe is that, he's going to pay because it's better to pay than to be online in the system kind of thing. You know what I mean? It's like, if he has a scheduled surgery or some type of thing that he needs, and under the Canada system, even though if he gets VIP treatment, they tell him, well, you're going to wait 4 months for this procedure. I don't know how it works, but I do know that, if you've got the money, you'll spend it, I think. It's still not, the Canada has a better system than the States. It's still not insulating him from having to spend his own money on his medical care at this point. And so that's what makes it frightening. And why, and it leads into all the brain injury, because at the end of the day, that's what the sport is. You're supposed to incapacitate your opponent.
Correct.
So when we don't have our arms around, and what's weird is, there's some guys that probably can get knocked out 4, 5, 6. I don't know what the number is, but there's a threshold there and their recovery is pretty good.
Yes.
They still talk. They've been knocked out a few times, but they can still talk. They can still hold down a job. They can still count change. And those are pretty minimal barometers, right? But the problem is that moving number. You get a guy that's like, well, he's fine. He got knocked out 3 times. Then you get another guy. So every individual is real different. That's where the medical part comes in. Is how do you wrap your arms around, what is a very individualized thing? It's like, how many times can this guy get knocked out before, that? And with Stevenson, I think you also see a little bit of I don't know if you can prevent it in we're here because we love boxing. We're here because we love the sport aside. Now, in this podcast, we're taking on a dark side of the sport, right? Because you never want to see a guy get carried out, but in Adonis Stevenson situation, he's walked in the fight with no flags, right?
None.
He'd been stopped. If I'm not mistaken, he'd been stopped in his earlier fights. Let me just make sure I got the right record here.
He was 29, 2 and 1, 24 KOs, 2 KOs where he'd been stopped and 1 draw. I think that's the way it goes.
Yeah, Darnell Boone knocked him out early, but that was so long ago. And at the end of the day, he kind of evaded. There's the other aspect of it is, in boxing, these types of things get, machoed over. You know what I mean? So he got knocked out by Darnell Boone. Darnell Boone was 16 and 15 at the time of the knockout, right? So he was a journeyman level fighter who broke through and sent it to the canvas when Stevenson was, fighting an 8-round fight. So it was a down fight for him, although he was breaking out and going to the United States to fight for the first time. So he got stopped, and then, he has his share of fights, and eventually he fights Darnell Boone again and knocks Darnell Boone out.
Yeah.
Now, Darnell Boone 19 and 20 heading into that fight. So after he was 16 and 15 heading into the Adonis Stevenson fight, then he was 17 and 15. And he walks in 19 and 20, so he went 2 and 5 between fights against Adonis Stevenson. So you're talking about a complete journeyman, with some, a dangerous journeyman with his power or whatever, but a journeyman nonetheless, So Stevenson had been down and out before, but recovered it. And the bottom line again is that first fight was in 2010, so that's long history. It's anybody could be knocked out 7 years ago, and if they've been not knocked out since. There's not going to be a concern over it. But I don't know. After our first knockout, would there have been some type of way to identify that he was more susceptible to this? Because here, then he cruises for 7 years, doesn't really hit the canvas, doesn't really get knocked out. And here, he got bludgeoned, and, you would think a sturdy guy, it doesn't take away. He's a strong guy, but he couldn't put up with it. And there really are no signs. It's not like he was like his opponent, Andres Fonfara. Andres Fonfara is a dangerous guy, but Andres Fonfara has been knocked silly a couple of times. So every time he gets in the ring, that's an X factor. We know it. We didn't know it about Stevenson.
Okay, so let me address a couple of things here through just through my studies. So number one, you ask, are there any indicators that we can look at to know whether or not we should be nervous about this guy or not? That has nothing to do with him being knocked out or not. And the answer to that is yes, there are indicators that we can look at that I'm shocked that they haven't started to use yet.
Well, let me ask you, this is a follow-up question. And you might know this, just a general yes or no,
Okay.
or you don't know. But if we applied that indicator, would we rule out just about everybody who's been knocked out?
No,
once?
no, not at all. No, not at all.
Okay, that's all right. Then continue.
Okay, so the number one indicator that can tell us whether or not someone is going to have long-term issues, all-E-like issues. So guys that are going to develop specifically chronic traumatic encephalopathy or CTE. The number one indicative indicator for those guys, the number one indicator for that particular disease is a genetic predisposition of a strand called ApoE4. So that's ApoE4. So if they have ApoE4 in their genetic strand, and I don't know enough about the genetic stranding to be able to tell you exactly how to locate that. I'm not a geneticist, but I know enough about it to talk about that in pretty great detail. But we won't bore everybody with that for now. But yeah, they can test for that. You can.
Okay, so let me ask you a question though. But that's a DNA test. So you have to know what
you
your
can.
DNA
You can spit
is.
in a 23andMe and get that tested right now.
Okay.
So you can.
In general, most people still don't walk around with that done to this day, and there's no requirement athletically.
We know that 1 in 8 people carry the ApoE4 genetic predisposition.
Okay, and therefore, there's no reason to believe anything different, that it wouldn't be 1 in 8 boxers.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Now, here's the thing. With ApoE4, that does not in any way predispose you to develop dementia, Alzheimer's, CTE, any of that, unless you develop head trauma. But if you have head trauma, then that greatly increases your chances. Now, here's the big indicator, though. 1 head trauma, you should be really careful after that. 2 head traumas, very, very careful. 3 head traumas, man, you're in trouble. You're done. You need to stop. That's it. No more. So if a fighter has ApoE4, and they get knocked out 3 times, their card should be pulled. They should be done forever. Same thing with football players. The same thing with divers, soccer players, people who play rugby, and that list goes on and on. Anybody who has where their head bounces. So water skiing is one of those that people wouldn't think about. So in any of that kind of stuff, where the head or the brain's being bounced a lot, they're going to sustain the process that happens that produces amygdaloid plaque deposits. I'll go into that later in a different podcast because it takes too long. But yes, so there is a test that we can do to do that. So there's the number one indicator. Number 2, age. Age is a huge indicator as to whether or not a person should continue to fight. And we know that, right? Like we see guys that have been great their whole lives. Chuck Liddell. Chuck was great his whole life, and then all of a sudden he gets hit one time he turns 37 or whatever it was, and you kind of see him lose a step, right? And when he loses that step, all of a sudden he loses his chin too. And then after that one time, he has no chin left. Like once you lose the chin once, It's just kind of gone for some people. And I don't know, maybe you can talk about that. Like, tell me about what you think of that, what you know about that. What happens when they lose their chin? Tell me historically, or talk about that. Tell me that.
All right, but let's be clear about a couple of things. What you're talking about is the knockout, which is the disconnect, I'm not conscious at this moment from being hit. Because this is what worries me, and this is what, again, now we're into the steroid world. And in steroids and stuff, one of the things that we've addressed is that you really can't police it. So if you can't police it, what do we do? It's kind of a joke, right? Here, you really can't police this, right? Because what can we do? What can we say? Adonis Stevenson got knocked out by Darnell Moon in 2010, and then he just got knocked out by Oleksandr Gvozdyk this last weekend. So he's up to 2. But, there's got to be some added damage with the sustained just bouncing of the brain, as you said. So every time he gets hit, he didn't go out. He's even been successful fights. But, every time he's gotten hit, now you're talking about sparring. Has he been hurt? Did he get knocked out in sparring? I don't know if he's the kind of guy that trains that rugged, but people do get stopped and dropped and stuff like that in sparring. And oftentimes there's attempts to hide it on some team's parts and things like that, because, it is a little bit of a negative. How do you actually keep track and know how many times the guy's been, removed from his senses completely by a punch?
Well, let me answer that real quickly, because oddly enough, I had started the development of a research program to look into that. Newsflash, cheap pander here. If anyone out there is looking for someone to do a fellowship for a PhD, I have the perfect study for brain injury, and it's about practice. And we have the perfect invention to measure exactly what the punch, the dimensions, the size, everything about the punch, and the fighter's consciousness during the punch, wearing a headband. So get a hold of me, please. I want to do this. Please call me. We can do this. Give me the money. I'll make you billions off of pharmaceutical companies. Anyways, so shameless pander there. But yeah, we can measure that, because subsequently, one thing that we know a little bit about is we know that fighters sustain as much damage in practice as they actually do in the ring. And then they've changed that quite a bit.
Practice is every day, right?
Yeah.
And that's the problem, and not every day, but you're practicing, you're a professional, you're going through your training regimen on an almost daily basis. That's your job. So
yeah,
it's the kind of thing where there really is. It's either we accept that it's going to happen every once in a while, and I think we've come to that. Really, it's news, and everybody gets sad and stuff like that. But boxing almost has this way of, okay, sorry, and the commit, but moving on quickly so that it doesn't become a big deal, kind of thing too. Because if we dwell on this, and this guy who's a former world champion is hooked up to a machine for 6 months, and that's in the media in Canada and then worldwide or whatever, on a weekly basis or whatever. That's not good for boxing, right?
Yeah.
So boxing has a tendency to not allow that to happen. That also, Stevenson probably is going to be on his own. I don't think the promoter is going to go over there and hey, I'll take care of the bill or whatever. You know what I mean? So it's just going to be interesting to see how this plays out and follows up. But again, that's what these guys were doing. That's what it's about. And the kind of thing is more policing, right? Do you get to a point where there are people who are going to say, my brother's a doctor, and he has kids, and there was a call in his high school to ban the football team because of head injury, and at the end of the day, this is not high school. I'm sorry, this is junior high school. So you're talking about 7th and 8th graders. I don't even know what is that, 12, 13 years old nowadays. So young kids, so people are worried about this stuff for young kids. But you're talking about banning football, So boxing could fall, in a wave of that. if something, were to really be badly publicized and you get a wave of let's ban, head trauma type sports and stuff, boxing could suffer a lot. Lose the ground they've gained on television. And at the end of the day, we've already discussed this over and over. I don't think anyone who listens to a fight podcast is going to be befuddled by it. I think people are going to fight. So, you don't want to drive the sport from the mainstream and from the limelight back into the fucking warehouse, because then, really things get much more dangerous.
Oh, yes.
So, you're trying to mitigate something that's already very dangerous. And you hope every fighter walks in there knowing that and stuff, like I said, with Adonis Stevenson, it's just very hard to have predicted that this was a possibility. Gvozdyk, yeah, he's got a lot of knockouts and stuff like that, but it's one of those things that I think we're going to be having another podcast like this in the next 18 to 24 months. Something else will happen, and we'll be looking at it in MMA. I mean, we could, if you want to go into the history of MMA and stuff, we could tell a lot of, stories about injuries there and the old Doug Dage incident where, a fighter died in the cage in Russia.
Yeah.
And he was out of Georgia. You know what's funny? I don't know if you ever caught on to this. You know who fought Doug Dage?
No, I do not know who fought him.
Sean Brockmall. And we can get into true boxing history. And for example, before 1840, there were basically no rules. It was just kind of a gentleman's agreement, and if the guy went down, you had 30 seconds to clean him up and send him back out. And then there was a death. And they brought in the Broughton rules, which were to clean up a little bit. And they were very, very extremely limited rules, But it's the start of it. So what I see is the problem with this is every generation, I think, has to have its own example. And I know
this might be putting you on the spot, and if it is, we'll clip this out. But do you know who the death was? Who the first boxing official death was?
Oh, there've been many deaths before that.
Oh, okay. Never mind then.
The problem with it was that Broughton and at the time and stuff. You're talking about a sport that was backed by certain members of the British aristocracy at that point. So it's like the manly men guys that fox hunt and do all that kind of shit that like fights, and then the tea drinking, art collecting type that are appalled by it, So they get arrested and get stopped and stuff, and there was a real call to stop it, like the anti people. So Broughton came up with the rules in order to sort of, gloss over the situation, or at least make it seem as if it was addressed. So in 1840, we already had an example of, adaptations to the sport for this, But I said it, and I think unfortunately this is the kind of thing where I think every generation kind of needs their own examples, and that means that we keep rolling these boys out there, and when it happens, that's going to impact the guys that see it and the guys that were watching it and the guys there. Yeah. It doesn't have the same impact 20 years later, even though, if you meet Gerald McClellan now, I'm sure it'll impact you. You know what I mean? So, but that's the thing. So, because the Adonis Stevenson situation now, he's just like any other fighter, But the thing is true prevention. There really is no real way to prevent it because, let's say we had said, Adonis, you're 41 now, and you've held it, but you're the longest reigning champion. You can't box anymore. You're again, now you get into taking away a man's living. It got taken away from him brutally, but still, are you if you had to explain it to Adonis Stevenson and tell him, look, for your own good, you can't box anymore. Go train or go get a job at Walmart or go retire, but you cannot box anymore. Once again, you still can't prevent him from sparring and doing things in the gym and stuff. He can still take headshots and still be subject to this. But it won't happen in a professional match anymore. He would probably chafe at that. He said, I haven't lost a fight in 8 years. How dare you? You know what I
Hey, I
mean?
was looking
And
up.
so,
Sorry to cut you off there, but it brought up the idea that I was looking up his weight, and perhaps you can fill me in on this more. Do you know what his fighting weight was? He's his division is light heavyweight. I mean, I understand that, which in boxing in Canada would still be 205, right, or 206?
no. Boxing's weight classes are completely different. So light heavyweight is 176 pounds. 200 to 177 up is cruiserweight, which we don't have in MMA.
Okay.
And then, so
Wow,
trust me
I'm
on that.
off.
He's
Sorry.
176 pounds on the scale the day before.
That's why you're the expert. Okay, so let
Yep.
me ask you this. He's a big man. I mean, he's a big man of stature, and he's 5'11", and when you look at him, he's very muscular, and he's a mountain of a man. He's got to be cutting weight, right?
Yeah, I would think so.
Okay, so we know this. Well, we speculate this in my early research, before I ran out of money doing it, was on its way to proving the damage that happens in headshots from people who cut weight versus those who do not. And I wonder what you think about that. How do you feel about? Do you see a difference in weight cutters getting knocked out easier, or at least when they get knocked out, they suffer a lot more. They have longer periods off. They don't wake up as quickly, etc. Talk to me about that a little bit. I don't know if you have.
No,
I think you can. I'm sure you can.
well, here's the thing: is just recognizing the gravity of the discussion and the scientific aspect that you bring to it with, your studies. You talked about your families, how your family situation kind of drove you to become knowledgeable in this stuff.
Yeah.
To fucking unbelievable motivator, right? So, with that, scientific aspect of it, I think that is a question that should be scientifically reviewed. I think it should be looked at by knockouts and go in it. Here's the real problem, and I think in MMA, it's just as much of a problem, but in boxing, it may even be more aggravating. I'll tell you. But the bottom line is boxers aren't accustomed to telling you that much about their weight cuts.
Right.
You know what I mean?
They're very secretive.
So you can't find out. In MMA, sometimes Chael Sonnens and some people like that also tell you about it. But I think if they had their chops, and in MMA, it's always been more scrutinized. But I think if anyone really has their chops at a high level, they don't want you or the opponent or anyone to know what they've gone through. Whether it's good or bad, we had an easy weight cut or a bad weight cut. They don't want you to know. What do you weigh? Oh, I don't know. And I think that's part of the problem. You'd have to have people like off the record or somebody to say, look, if you're cutting 35 pounds a day before, we need to know now for science. Don't lie to me, so that we can't distinguish or whatever. So that's going to make it difficult. But I think it warrants the question enough that it should be looked at rather than speculated on. I think speculation. Weight cutting is a weird thing because as you mentioned, age is a big factor in it.
Huge.
People have their systems that are down. The way they do it and how they do it. I've seen some real abusive things like salt baths and the types of things that people take. In order to cut the extreme cut.
Explain that to people, Miguel.
Well, what's the fucking Epsom? What's the salt that you put on?
Epsom salt.
It's the salt. Yeah, the salt you put on snow.
I mean, tell the audience about that so they can understand what you're talking about.
They fill a bathtub up with it and they sit in it, and the salt is actually absorbing fluids and water and things. At such a rate that it helps dehydrate the body, basically.
Yeah.
Saunas. We've seen saunas kill people.
Yeah.
I saw a fighter in Costa Rica that had to cut weight, and the hotel didn't have a sauna because the whole country's a sauna. Who needs a sauna here? you know. So, but this guy put a porta potty out on an empty tennis court. And you know how the sun beats down on a tennis, tennis courts are no trees and stuff. So the sun was beating down on that porta potty, and he stood in there for hours cutting away. It was really the most horrendous thing I've ever seen.
On the equator.
But people are willing to put themselves through. A lot of it is also the fighters' mindsets and things. So that's what makes me, it really becomes something that you almost have to have individual rules, like you got to know your people real well. And everything we see in this sport, is that they're trying to make everything cookie cutter so that, anybody can do it. Anybody can be a commissioner and stuff. And nobody really actually has to sit and know what's going on in the sport.
Okay. Let's end with this. Okay. First of all, I want to point something out that you said in 2 podcasts ago. You stated that just to discuss the cookie cutter approach, you stated that someone's wife, that some boxer's wife or some fighter's wife or some referee's wife was a judge because her husband was a fighter or was a referee or something. And how in the hell does that give her any credentials to be a judge? Yet she is. So we have to not excuse me, it's cold out here. We have to find out how to qualify people to scientifically decide how these fighters are going to be safe or not. I have some ideas about that. If the commission would like to call me, we can go through those, and I can show you scientifically how we can draw blood, go through every bit of this, and we can quantify every bit of this and stop a whole bunch of these problems right now. Give me a call, 765-210-0123. Please call me, please. But what do you think, Miguel? What's the answer as far as let's say you and I have an answer, okay? And we've talked about it in pretty great detail, and we really do have a really interesting scientific program that we could follow and we could do a lot with. But we don't want to go into that here because, frankly, we don't want to give up our methods and have somebody steal them before we can do them, because we want to be able to do them. If it came down to that, I would rather give them up than have somebody else be hurt, but I'd rather do them ourselves. But having said that, let's say that we have the methods right now, right in front of us, and we can do it. How do we institute that? How do we implement those methods? How does it happen? Because it's got to happen at some point.
It's a boxing podcast. We're talking Adonis Stevenson. Boxing's very fractured. How do you implement that across countries? Where commissions are going to be different and things like that. Those are all active problems. And then there's the natural suspicion of boxing to outsiders. You know what I mean? Something new and stuff like that. The bottom line is for the safety of the fighters, there has to be like a ground or an area where we all talk and everybody's talking honest. So things like, was he knocked out prior to the fight? The boxer is open to answering truthfully, yeah, I was. So that the medical research and the research can be done properly. Getting to that point is going to be is a task. And then there's the whole policing and monitoring things. The simple answer to me is you take all the resources that you're putting into steroids and you put it into this, and you've done a terrifically great thing for the sport, and for the prevention or for the hopeful benefit of the sport in the future, where we're preventing and actively able to tell guys. I think the thing about it is if you had Adonis Stevenson before this fight and you tell him, look, we took the recent scan and there's this thing there, now you're over 40 and stuff, you've got a percentage chance of really being in bad shape if you take a shot. There's a percentage of fighter that retires right there. you know. And then some people say, oh, he's not a fighter, you know, and you might get into macho bullshit and stuff like that. I'm saying that's a good thing. I'm saying you start an honest approach where a guy goes, it's me or my life. I'm going to take my life. I'll go walk over here and go work at Walmart. Some guys will do that. Other guys will be in denial, say, no way, I'm a world champion, you know, and it's a horrendous, and that's why it's a steep, you know, to you don't have a perfect world. But you can take a better shot at it than we're doing right now, you know. But that's, I think it starts with having a neutral ground where the athletes actually feel that you're doing them some good, and not that you're running them through hoops and you know, making them, hey, wake up at 4 in the morning, piss here, right? You know, that's what you got to do. It's like I don't think any of that shit works.
Yeah, man, I couldn't agree with you more on that. It has to be something where it's the athlete's friend. If that's not the case, I think that it absolutely harms the athlete. We're reconnecting right now. We lost our connection. But the one other thing I'll say on this, and then we'll just close out, is that the first athlete to ever really utilize that was Troy Aikman of the Dallas Cowboys. He'd taken 3 concussions. They said, if you take another concussion, this one, concussion studies had just started to come out in the early mid-90s. I think it was 96. And Troy said, I'm going to retire. And he retired early, and everybody was like, what? What are you doing? So hats off to Troy, and he's very, very happy he did, and we see why now. Looks like we lost connection with Miguel. We're going to have to reconnect. Hey, this has been a great podcast. We appreciate you guys. Listen, if you don't subscribe, it doesn't do us a lot of good. So please hit the red button below, subscribe, let us know how we're doing. We appreciate everybody watching. We saw a huge jump in views over the last several days, and we know that we're starting to penetrate the Twitter sphere, etc. So keep it up. Share this. Share it with everybody. Tell everybody you know about this. And by all means, tell us what we need to know. Tell others what you think of us. If you don't like us, tell us. If you do like us, tell everyone else. Thanks to everyone. Namaste.
If you wear this or not, maybe I don't even know how to begin with this. So I'm just gonna put it out there. I'm gonna be blunt, gonna be frank, because why not? Because, you know, it's frank. Quit doing that. Straighten up. Okay. Anyway, just for the record, I'm not putting the fucking truck away. Sit the fuck back down. I'm not putting the fucking truck away.